This is a quick session, it's 30 minutes, so we'll try to get through as much of this material as possible and hopefully leave some time for one or two questions. Let me first introduce this panel. We have with us Margie Milam, who is the IP enforcement and DNS policy lead at Meta. Margie supervises Meta's domain enforcement litigation program and advocates for policy improvements at ICANN that promote internet security. Margie's previous roles include serving as vice president at ICANN, general counsel of Mark Monitor, partner at the law firm of Pillsbury Winthrop. We were both partners there together, where she specialized in corporate and IP law. Mason Cole is also with us, and he has been at ICANN for quite some time. He's the internet governance advisor at Perkins Coie. Mason has been involved in internet domain name expansion, issues management, and brand protection for more than 20 years. A recognized leader in internet governance, he serves as chair of ICANN's business constituency, where he's a vocal proponent of responsible policy development for business users and brand holders. So with that, I'm going to jump in real quick to what our topics are going to be for today. We're going to talk about the status of the domain name registration data, Whois. That's always a topic that never seems to go away. Update on DNS abuse discussions, governmental interests in domain name policy outcomes, NIS2 updates, important stuff. Update on subsequent procedures, that's the new gTLDs, and then I'll show you what some of the meetings, upcoming meetings are going to be in 2023. So as an online brand protection provider, pursuant to our standard workflow processes, we send out notices to registrars, registries, and proxy providers to get the ownership information of potentially infringing domain names. And as many of you know, this information has been redacted on most of the domain names as a result of GDPR. So this is kind of the current situation that we're seeing in terms of sending out some of these notices. There's still no standardized process for requests across 2,000 plus registrars. Mason may talk a little bit about how that's going to work as it moves forward. Some registrars are more sophisticated than others in handling requests. The responses that you receive back from the registrars still vary widely. Some registrars are cooperative and will supply data. Some registrars will require a subpoena, legal order, or UDRP. Some will not even respond to your request, right? So you don't even know what whether they even got it or not. And registrars must ask for underlying data if proxy is employed. We sent out between January 1st and August 31st, we sent out 2,751 requests to 340 ICANN accredited registrars. And so these are all notices for requesting information, the ownership information. And of those 2,751 requests, 395 were compliant, and this was only related to the registrars. And when you add in the registries and add in the proxies, that jumped up to about 26%. So it's not insignificant. Asking for the information, I think is something that should be a part of everybody's workflow process. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Mason to talk about access.
Thanks, Faisal. Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Mason Cole. It's good to be with you today. Thanks for attending the webinar. Let me just dive right in and continue Faisal's update on where policy stands with regard to Whois. So as Faisal mentioned, many things regarding Whois are up in the air. ICANN, the industry governance body over domain name policy, has been working towards some sort of codified Whois policy now for more than 20 years, and we're still not quite there. So the latest here in developments, if you've been following the news, is that there was a proposal for what was called an SSAD, a standardized system for access and disclosure. And that would have been a centralized system for requesting Whois data from registrars and registries in a centralized fashion where everything would come together in one portal and the data would be distributed through that portal. There was a very prohibitive estimated price tag associated with the SSAD, somewhere on the order of $20 to $27 million, and roughly a 2-year development schedule. The community found that to be prohibitive and not something that they decided to go forward with. And so there was a decision to scale back, scrub the SSAD as proposed in favor of what many of us in the community are calling more of a low-level ticketing system. So what does that ticketing system proposal look like? Well, ICANN published a design paper. There's a link to it in the presentation here, and I understand the presentation will be made available after the webinar. But it's called a Whois disclosure system, or WDS. That paper was published on September 13th, right before the ICANN meeting kicked off in Malaysia earlier this month. In reality, a better title for this would be a Whois request system, because disclosure is not mandated under the WDS. So this again would be a portal system that would be built on top of existing ICANN systems. And that portal would funnel requests to registrars who electively participate in the system. Participation on the part of registrars is not mandatory, nor is registry participation. So in reality, what you have is a funnel that would drive requests to participating registrars, and that's really it. So this presents some hazards to brand owners. And what are some of those potential hazards? Well, there's probably no real change in the rate of disclosure, of actual Whois disclosure. Critics of the system could allege that if the system isn't rigorously used, then there really isn't very much demand for Whois data. Now, we all know that that's not the case, but there are those who really don't want advancement in Whois policy, and in a sort of a political sense, they can allege that there's no real demand. As I mentioned, it's merely a funnel to route some requests to the same registrars who are probably disclosing right now. And the fact that there's no registry data makes the system over-reliant on registrars who are traditionally reluctant to participate. So what would then make the system more valuable to users? Well, a design that anticipates mandatory registrar and registry participation would be good, because the community views this as sort of step one in a Whois disclosure system. And the hope is that IP owners and others can drive some change into ICANN that would advance the Whois disclosure system to actually be a disclosure system. And in order to do that, they need to build a bigger system to anticipate more registrar participation. But so far, that's not the case. We'd like to see logging of requests as a measurement of demand, even for non-participating registrars, to counter the argument that there really isn't much demand for Whois data out there. We'd also like to see transparency in results reporting, which include things like disclosure rates and reasons for non-disclosure, so that we can really see how deeply the system is being used. And then there should be anticipation of ongoing evolution of the system to accommodate changes in regulation. For example, the European Union's NIS2 directive that will be codified later in the year. And I know Margie's going to talk about NIS2 shortly. Okay, Faisal, back to you.
Yeah, I have a real quick question. Can ICANN force disclosure, or have a stick on this based on the temp spec? That's
a good question. Even if they can, they're disinclined historically to enforce against registrars and registries. They're reluctant to do so. So under the temp spec, even if you could leverage the temp spec to force disclosure, ICANN compliance is notoriously a weak function, and you can't necessarily count on ICANN to help you with reveals.
Yeah, Margie, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, Mason's right. Theoretically, ICANN could forward the requests, and that triggers some sort of response requirement, but that's a very different thing, a response versus a disclosure. So a response saying, yes, we received your inquiry, but the answer is still no. That is something ICANN could do, but I think we heard at the meeting that they don't feel like making this anything more than a voluntary system.
And it's my understanding. Okay, so now you've got the online. You've got the design phase now. That's done, right? Because they've got their requirement documents pretty much done. How long is it going to take? When are they going to start the build out? And then how long is it going to take? to get it done?
Well, that's up in the air, Faisal. It's supposed to be built on an existing ICANN portal that registrars and registries use, called the Naming Services Portal. So the software is already there in theory, and all ICANN really needs to do is build it out. So in theory, it shouldn't take very long. But there's still some argument in the community about what it's going to look like, and I think until those arguments are settled, we're not going to see any progress on it, probably until close to the end of the year, if not a little bit beyond that. ICANN, in fact, is hosting a couple of webinars in October on further comment on the WDS, and so there's still an opportunity for community feedback and questions. So this is sort of standard procedure for ICANN. They tend to talk things over for quite a while until they actually start building a system.
Hey, Margie, do you anticipate that they're going to add in registries and proxies as well, proxy providers?
We certainly asked for it at the ICANN meeting because I think that makes it a more complete solution. But we're getting a lot of pushback in that they're trying to make it light and easy to implement and minimize the cost. So I'm not optimistic that we'll get there. I think more on the proxy side, I think that's more likely than on the registry side, because there's a lot of pressures we'll talk about later about ICANN not having implemented other policies, and one of them being the proxy and policy that had been adopted years ago.
Got it. All right, Margie.
Yeah, and one of the things I think that's really interesting over the last, say, year and a half is that governments have become much more active in DNS outcomes, and that's and it hasn't always been the case. And if you ask why is that happening, that's happening because of the impact of GDPR on Whois access. In a way, if you look at it, the reason that the Whois system went, we call it dark in the sense that it's no longer publicly available. That's because of the limitations that were recognized when GDPR was passed. And so as a result of that, there's been a lot of movement to try to update the policy to be in line with GDPR. And the constant pushback has been we need more clarity from governments on how GDPR applies in the application to Whois. So what you see is that the European Union took the initiative and is now in the process of updating this security directive called the NIS2. That's the shorthand for the Network Information Systems Directive that was around for a few years, but it's now for the first time going to create obligations that relate to Whois. So this is really great news for brand holders. And it's the first time that a significant piece of legislation related to the domain name system has been implemented. So that's one area where we're seeing government involvements. We're also seeing them on the state-by-state level as privacy laws are being considered. And you can ask, well, why is it that the governments are regulating the domain name system? As I mentioned, for some reason, ICANN's been very slow in implementing policies. And in fact, they haven't even implemented a policy since 2016. And that's really frustrating because a lot of really important work has been done over the years, like the policy on proxy services and privacy services that had community consensus and has since been tabled. And the other thing we're seeing is, in recent years, especially after the initiation of, the COVID pandemic, huge increases in DNS abuse. There's lots and lots of studies, and I think you're all seeing it for your brands on increased phishing, increased fraud. And so cybersecurity and law enforcement authorities are looking for access to be able to mitigate some of this abuse. And that's exactly what the NIS2 does. The other interesting thing is that ICANN itself has told the world that they can't solve the Whois issue without governments intervening. Joran Marby, the CEO of ICANN, has said that, the Whois issue resulted from GDPR. So if the European Union wants to fix this, they need to find a regulation to do so. And so that's what prompted this really interesting shift in how governments deal with domain name issues.
Margie, do you think that the system, this WDS, is designed to either help, maybe to some extent help ICANN determine whether to what they need, what's needed, whether they can actually solve this on their own, and maybe government intervention is not needed. So if, for example, they stand up a disclosure system and the brands aren't putting anything into the system, is that going to inform the world that maybe we don't need a disclosure system? And maybe what should brand holders who are sitting here today be doing about it?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the risks that Mason mentioned. If brands don't submit requests when that system is live, that statistic will be used in the policy forums to say, do we really need Whois? Is this all necessary? Let's just leave it the way it is and not change anything. And that, I think, would be an unfortunate result.
Got it.
So if you think about how governments are involved in ICANN, they do it through this thing called the Government Advisory Committee, and each country actually has a couple of representatives that represent them at ICANN to talk about policy issues, and they try to come up with consensus positions, they call it, where they give advice to the ICANN board on how to deal with some of these important issues. And the GAC has been very good at giving, advice and highlighting the importance of, complete and accurate Whois and access to Whois, as well as domain name abuse and pushing ICANN to do something to try to solve this problem of growing increased, phishing and fraud that we're seeing in the domain name system. And so that's all done through the Government Advisory Committee. And that's the way that it works in the ICANN sphere. But that's also separate and apart from the regulatory side that I just talked about. And so as I mentioned, the really great news is this European Union NIS2 directive as it relates to the domain name system. It was part of this comprehensive update to how the European Union deals with security related issues. And it creates a new Article 23 that has obligations related to Whois. And specifically, it mandates complete and accurate and verified Whois information. That's if that actually gets implemented I think you'll see an entirely different set of Whois and utility in the Whois system. Because even in the case like Faisal mentioned, where we get responses to our requests for information, oftentimes that information is not even accurate and it's like on its face false. And so having this requirement is going to really, I think, lift up the value of the Whois data. It'll require the publication of the Whois data of legal persons. So there'll be a requirement to make a distinction between legal person's data and natural person's data. Now, for natural person's data, you'd still have to make a request like you do today. But, based on, estimates, we think maybe 50–60% of the data should be publicly available, because that should reflect what's owned by a legal person instead of a natural person. They're also making sure that there wouldn't be any charges for access, and that there would be access for legitimate access seekers. And then the final point related to NIS2 is that legitimate access seekers is defined as any legal or natural person that makes a request based on union or national law. So it's not limited to just cybersecurity purposes, even though the directive was focused on security purposes. The fact that you can cite to European trademark law is an added benefit that enables you to get access to the Whois information when you need to, based on your investigations or your enforcement efforts.
Margie, what's the timeline on maybe ratification and implementation of NIS2? Do we know?
Yeah, if you could go to the next slide, it's on the next slide.
Oh, good. There you go.
There you go. So essentially, we understand the negotiations to develop this directive are over, and the language is to be ratified in November. So in November, we should see the publication. So very soon, a publication of this Article 23, which is the provision that deals with domain name Whois information. And then once that, it doesn't necessarily go into immediate effect. What it does is it requires all the member states. So that means each individual country has to adopt laws within 21 months that transposes those requirements into their own law. So just think of, France and Germany and all the countries in the EU. They'll have to develop their own law that's consistent with the directive. And so that's where you may see additional obligations, because they're not limited to what's in the NIS2. They just have to make sure they conform to it. But there's nothing that prevents them from increasing the obligations that relate to NIS2. And so we're going to see interesting things happening during that ratification process. There might be calls for clarifying what verification means, or what does accuracy mean in terms of Whois. And that's one area where brand holders might be interested in seeing how they can affect that in states that member states, countries that they might have influence in.
Thanks, Margie. Mason.
Thanks, Faisal. So another hot topic in the domain name industry is the issue of DNS abuse, and this has been talked about pretty extensively for the past couple of years. And I'm cognizant of time, Faisal. I'm going to be fairly quick with these slides. So how is DNS abuse being defined? Well, it's very narrowly defined by the ICANN community. It has to do with specifically malware, botnets, phishing, farming, and spam as a delivery vehicle of the previous 4 issues. So that's all good and fine, but security experts are telling us that's great, but no definition is ever going to be suitably comprehensive of what DNS abuse really is. So there's a schism in the community about what constitutes DNS abuse, but we're tackling the first 5 issues first. How is DNS abuse being addressed today? Contracted parties, which mean registries and registrars, have put in some voluntary measures. They've started a DNS Abuse Institute, which is advancing voluntary measures on DNS abuse. They've got a framework that contracted parties sign on to that elucidates what they should be doing to combat DNS abuse. And then there's a new tool called the ACID tool, stands for Abuse Contact Identifier. That's something you should bookmark as owners, because the ACID tool helps you identify the hosting provider behind the content that may be infringing on your brands. So there are some things on the voluntary side that are being done, but they don't reach all the bad actors in the space. So additional regulation is needed. So what progress is being made with regard to DNS abuse? Well, we're actually hearing some encouraging signs from contracted parties who are talking about entertaining updates to the registrar, the registrar accreditation agreement and the registry agreement to put language in there that establishes an affirmative duty to mitigate DNS abuse versus what's in there now, which is a current duty to, quote, investigate and respond appropriately, which is kind of a loose responsibility on the part of contracted parties. One thing that we're unclear about right now is what mitigate actually means. We're in the early part of discussions about those contract changes, but those contract updates would then be followed by, oh no, yes, it's true, an ICANN policy development process that would refine those abuse-related procedures, such as service level agreements for what those mitigation duties entail. Next slide, Faisal. Okay, thanks. What are desired outcomes regarding DNS abuse from brand holders? Well, we do applaud and want to see continued expansion of industry-led voluntary measures. We do also really want to see ICANN have the ability to enforce against known bad actor registrars. There are somewhere on the order of a dozen or so out there who we know harbor abusive registrations and content. And we want ICANN to have the ability to enforce against those. And we also want some better intelligence to identify and mitigate the threat vectors as they emerge. So what happens next? Again, there are going to be contract amendment, presumably there will be a contract amendment negotiated between contracted parties and ICANN.org for universal coverage of contracted parties to establish the need to mitigate abuse. And we encourage brand holders to explore what are called trusted notifier relationships between content authorities and registries and registrars. A trusted notifier program is one where the contracted party establishes a relationship with an entity that they trust, who would send them notices of infringing content or bad behavior on the part of what's happening in the DNS, and encourage takedowns of infringing domain names or bad content. I think maybe there's one more slide. Nope, that's it for me. Faisal, back to you.
Thanks, Margie. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the new gTLDs. I know there's not much going on, but it'll be great to.
Sure, really fast. And obviously, it's been a long time since new gTLDs were first introduced. ICANN's been working for a while on how to improve that process. What we saw at the ICANN meeting last week, or yeah, I guess it was last week, was we got a timeline for when we're going to see an assessment on how the design will take place for the new gTLD program. So in other words, how the program will evolve to basically address all of these policy issues that were raised since the last round. So not much to report. We expect some an assessment to be delivered towards the end of this year. And we should be getting some community updates soon. So not much to report other than I can't imagine this happening any sooner than in 2 years. So if you're interested in submitting an application for your brands as a TLD, as a registry, it might be a while. And that's pretty much all I have as the update.
Perfect. So the next meetings are the following, the March 11th through 16th is the Cancun meeting. Then we have the policy forum here in Washington, DC, and the annual meeting in Hamburg, Germany. I think we believe that the more brand holders that can at least show up for the Washington, DC meeting, that would be great to voice your concerns or your opinions. There's a lot of voices out there, and we need brand holders to have a loud voice to enable policy decisions that benefit brand holders. So I think that's it from my standpoint. Margie, Mason, any last minute issues? We don't have any questions from the chat. You guys did such a great job that nobody really has any questions. So if not,
yeah, I guess I would say one of the, I think, problems we've seen in the ICANN policy space over the last 2 years is we've seen a noticeable drop off of involvement from brands. And I think that's hard. It's very hard to advocate for policies that help brands and help fight cybersecurity issues when the folks that are affected by it aren't showing up to the ICANN meetings and really advocating for it. And I know it's hard because everybody has a lot of differing responsibilities, right, as a brand holder. But I think the Washington, DC one is one where, it might be a great place to show up, even if it might be the only time you show up, to really, share your perspective on some of these important policy issues and how ICANN can help solve them.
And Mason, you're the chair of the BC constituency. It'd be great if you can get more people to join, more organizations to join your group.
It would be very welcome. The BC is the representative body of business users of the internet. We have representation of companies that range from small African startups all the way up to Fortune 50 companies. And Margie is correct. It's a challenging environment inside ICANN right now, and contracted parties hold the edge in terms of policy development. It would be very welcome if we had some additional voices show up in Washington, DC, or even in Cancun, where there are opportunities for to really make your position known and make ICANN aware that brand owners have a legitimate seat at the table, and there are needs that need to be met on the part of brand owners. So I do hope to see many of you at a future ICANN meeting. That would be very welcome. And if you're interested in joining the BC, I'd be happy to make my contact information available and welcome you to the BC.
Yeah, that would be great. All right, I think that's it from our side. Thank you so much, Margie. Thank you so much, Mason, and keep up the good fight.
Thanks, Faisal. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.